Welcome back to the English Prep Podcast, everybody. Today, we are going to take a deep dive into a skill that's super important for mastering English, and that is listening. It's funny how, we put a lot of focus on reading and writing, but listening is just as important, don't you think? Not just for exams like the IELTS, TOEFL, or the PTE, but for really navigating those everyday conversations confidently.
Oh, absolutely. I think listening is something that's often overlooked, but it's really the foundation of learning a new language. Unlike reading or writing, listening really asks us to process information in real time. It's almost as if your brain is putting on a live translation show, trying to keep up with every single word, intonation, and the context of everything that's being said.
Right. And for anyone who's preparing for English proficiency exams, knowing how to listen effectively can really be a game changer. I remember when I first started prepping for these exams, the listening sections always felt like the scariest part, especially with that added pressure of understanding different accents and people talking so fast.
I can only imagine. It's one thing to learn vocabulary from a textbook, but it's a whole other thing to apply that knowledge in real time when someone's speaking to you. But the good thing is, with the right approach and consistent practice, you can totally sharpen your listening skills and feel way more confident going into those exams.
That is very reassuring. So let's break it down. If you had to give one piece of advice to someone who's just starting out on their listening prep, what would it be?
I would say start by understanding the format of the specific exam you're going to take. Each of them has a unique structure and different types of questions. So, for example, the IELTS listening test, it's got 4 sections with a bunch of conversations and monologues, whereas the TOEFL listening section often uses longer, academic lectures. So familiarizing yourself with that format's going to help you know what to expect, which can really reduce anxiety and let you focus on the actual content itself.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like knowing the rules of a game before you start playing. So once you're familiar with the format, what's next?
Practice, practice, practice. And the key here is using real life materials that are close to what you'll actually encounter in the exam. And thankfully, there are a ton of resources available online in test prep books and even from the official exam websites themselves.
Oh, that's great to hear. So you're saying ditch the boring textbook dialogues and dive into real world English. Okay. But how do you deal with the variety of accents and speaking speeds? I mean, are we supposed to watch movies from every corner of the world and listen to podcasts with hosts from different countries?
Pretty much, yeah. The more you're exposed to different accents and speaking styles, the more comfortable you're going to get with understanding the nuances of how English is spoken. Think of it like training your ear to pick out all the different musical instruments in an orchestra. At first, it might just sound like, a bunch of random sounds, but as you practice, you start to pick out, the unique qualities of each instrument. And it's the same with accents.
That is a really good analogy. And what about those times when you feel like the speaker is talking so fast? What are some tips for keeping up with that fast speech?
Don't worry, you're not the only one who feels that way. It's something that happens to a lot of English learners. One helpful trick is to use the playback speed controls on your audio player or any online resources you're using. You can start by listening at a pace that's comfy for you, and then you can gradually increase the speed as you start to get better. It's kind of like slowly turning up the resistance on a treadmill. You're building up that listening stamina.
Okay, I like that. It's all about pushing yourself just a little bit outside of your comfort zone every time. But let's be real, sometimes even slowing down the audio isn't enough. There are times when you just need to pause and process what you've heard, right? Is it okay to, rewind and listen to the difficult bits multiple times?
Oh, totally. There is zero shame in hitting that rewind button. It's way better to fully understand a part than to rush through it and miss, key info. Think of it like savoring a delicious meal. You wouldn't want to just gobble it down in one bite, would you? You'd want to take your time and enjoy every single flavor. It's the same with listening. Take your time, rewind as needed, and let the information really sink in.
That is such a great way to put it. So we've talked about getting familiar with the exam format, practicing with real-life materials, and embracing all those accents. What other skills should we focus on to really boost our listening comprehension?
Well, one technique that's often forgotten about is note-taking. A lot of people think it's not needed for listening tests, but trust me, taking notes can really help with your understanding and remembering what you've heard.
Note-taking. I get it for lectures and presentations, but isn't the point of listening tests to, listen and understand? Wouldn't taking notes distract us from getting all the info?
That's a really common misunderstanding. Taking notes isn't about writing down every single word you hear. It's about actively engaging with the information and getting those key points down. Think of it like making a roadmap for yourself and marking the most important places along the way.
Okay, that makes sense. So, how do we take notes effectively during a listening test? Should we be, writing out full sentences?
No, not at all. Trying to write full sentences is only going to slow you down. Instead, you want to focus on coming up with a system of abbreviations and symbols that you can use to jot down info quickly. Like, for instance, instead of writing because, you could just use BC. It's all about finding those shortcuts that work for you.
That's a great tip. I'm always struggling to keep up with the speaker, so using abbreviations and symbols would really help. But what should we focus on when we're taking notes? Should we try to capture all the details or just the main ideas?
Go for the main ideas, those key facts, and any specific details that you think might be important for the test questions. Don't get stuck trying to write everything down. Remember, your notes are there to help you remember things later, not to make a perfect copy of what you heard.
So it's more about creating those mental snapshots of the most important information than writing a whole book.
Exactly. And once you finish listening, take a moment to look over your notes and see if you can sum up the main points in your own words. This helps you really understand and spot any gaps in your understanding.
Wow, these note-taking strategies are really helpful. It's amazing how such a simple thing can make a huge difference. So we've got our format down, we're practicing with real-world materials, we're embracing all those different accents, and we're taking notes like experts. What other tricks do you have to help us ace those listening sections?
Okay, let's talk about one of my favorite techniques for making both your listening and your pronunciation better: shadowing.
Shadowing, that sounds interesting. What exactly is that?
It's basically repeating what you hear as you're listening, almost like you're a vocal echo of the speaker. You try to copy their pronunciation, how their voice goes up and down, and the rhythm as closely as you can. It might feel a bit awkward at first, but trust me, it's a really powerful technique.
I can see how it would be good for pronunciation. But how does shadowing make your listening skills better?
When you shadow, you're forcing your brain to process the spoken language on a much deeper level. You're not just listening passively, you're actively trying to make the sounds, the rhythms, all those little things in the language. It's like doing a double workout for your brain, listening and speaking all at the same time.
So it's like your brain's doing a synchronized swimming routine, trying to keep everything in sync. It sounds like a really cool way to get the natural flow of English speech into your head. Any tips for making the most of this shadowing thing?
You can start with short audio clips and then make them longer as you get more comfy. Don't be afraid to break up longer parts into smaller bits. And don't worry about being perfect right away. The goal is to gradually get better at copying the speaker's rhythm and the way their voice goes up and down.
This is all awesome advice, but I keep thinking that understanding what you hear is more than just getting the pronunciation and intonation right. Vocabulary plays a big role, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Having a strong vocabulary is super important for understanding spoken English, especially in academic or professional situations where you might come across more, complex or specialized language.
So how can we build up our vocabulary for listening specifically? Is it all about memorizing lists of words and their definitions?
While memorizing word lists can help, the key is to learn vocabulary in context. Pay attention to how words are used in real conversations, movies, podcasts, and other authentic materials.
So it's more about understanding how words work in their natural environment rather than just knowing what the dictionary says. Any tips on making that process more effective? I often come across words I don't know while I'm listening, and it can be distracting to constantly pause and look them up.
I totally get that feeling. It's important to find a balance between actively listening and building your vocab. One thing you could do is write down any unfamiliar words as you're listening, and then look them up later. Another helpful tip is to use flashcards, but instead of just writing the definition, try writing a whole sentence that shows how the word is used in context.
Okay, I'm starting to see how it all comes together. But how do we know if we're making progress and not just going in circles? How do we measure if we're understanding more and stay motivated along the way?
That's a great question. One really good way to see how much you're improving is by taking practice tests regularly. Think of them like mini checkpoints on your learning journey. By trying to recreate the exam conditions, you can see how well you're understanding the material and figure out which areas need more work.
So it's like getting a progress report on our listening skills. But what about those times when we feel discouraged or just completely overwhelmed? What's your advice on staying motivated?
I think it's really important to remember that getting better at listening is a journey, not a destination. Be patient with yourself, celebrate all your progress, and most importantly, find ways to make learning fun. Choose stuff that you're interested in, listen in places that you feel good in, and don't be afraid to take breaks when you need them.
This has been such an insightful deep dive into listening skills. I'm feeling way more equipped to handle those tough listening sections now. Any last words of wisdom before we wrap up part one?
Remember that you're not alone on this path. There are millions of English learners all over the world who are working on their listening skills, and there are so many resources out there to help you succeed. So keep practicing, keep exploring, and most importantly, keep listening.
Well said. We'll be back with more tips and tricks in part two, so stay tuned.
We're back on the English Prep Podcast, and we're talking about how to level up your listening skills.
Yeah, we were just saying how crucial it is to make practice a regular thing,
Yeah.
Even if you're super busy, there are ways to fit it in.
Totally. It's about finding those little bits of time throughout your day and turning them into mini learning sessions. Think about when you're commuting, on your lunch break, even when you're just chilling at home. Instead of scrolling through your phone or browsing the internet, why not put on a podcast or listen to an audiobook?
So true. It's kind of like sneaking in a workout while you're doing your everyday things. I can definitely see myself listening to a podcast while I'm making dinner or doing chores. But how do you stay motivated when it starts feeling like a chore?
I think the trick is to pick things that actually grab your interest. Don't force yourself to listen to something boring just because you think it's good for you. If you're really into true crime, for example, there are tons of awesome podcasts out there that'll keep you hooked while you're also, being exposed to different accents and ways of speaking.
That is such a good point. Why torture yourself with boring stuff when you can learn just as much from something you actually enjoy, right? I personally love historical fiction audiobooks. It's like getting a history lesson and an exciting story all rolled into one.
Exactly. Learning should be something you enjoy, not something you dread. And speaking of keeping things fresh, don't be afraid to try out different genres and formats. Mix things up with podcasts, audiobooks, movies, TV shows, news broadcasts. The more variety you have, the more well-rounded your listening skills will become.
It's just like having a buffet of listening options. I'm all about that approach. But let's talk about setting goals for a sec. It's so easy to feel lost when you're trying to improve your listening. So how do we set realistic goals that'll keep us motivated and on track?
Well, I'd start by figuring out where you are now and what areas you need to work on most. Are certain accents really tough for you? Do you struggle to keep up with fast conversations? Once you've got a good grasp on your strengths and weaknesses, you can set smaller, achievable goals that'll slowly build up your confidence and skills.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like going to the doctor for a checkup before you start a new fitness plan. You need to know your starting point before you can set realistic goals. So what would a realistic goal look like for someone who's just starting out?
Instead of trying to understand every single word of a complex lecture right away, you could focus on just getting the main ideas first. Or maybe you set a goal to listen to one podcast a day or watch a 30-minute TV show in English with no subtitles. The key is to start small and then gradually make it harder, or listen for longer periods as you improve.
Those are great examples. It's all about breaking those big, scary goals down into smaller, more doable steps. And of course, celebrating those small wins along the way is super important for staying motivated. Speaking of challenges, what are some common roadblocks that English learners often hit when it comes to understanding what they hear?
One of the biggest ones is definitely dealing with unfamiliar accents. English is spoken all over the world, and like we talked about before, each region has its own way of pronouncing things and the way their voice goes up and down. It's no surprise that learners sometimes feel like they're listening to completely different languages.
Oh, I know exactly what you mean. I remember when I first started listening to podcasts from Australia, I was totally lost. It took a while to get used to the slang and the rhythm of Australian English.
It definitely takes some adjusting, but the good thing is, the more you listen to different accents, the easier it becomes to understand them. It's like training your ear to recognize different dialects.
So it's all about expanding our accent library and getting comfy with all the different ways English is spoken. Any tips for making that process more fun?
Absolutely. Instead of seeing it as a chore, think of it as a chance to explore different cultures and ways of talking. Watch movies and TV shows from different countries, listen to podcasts with hosts from all over the place, and even try connecting with native speakers online for some language exchange. It's a great way to broaden your horizons and improve your listening at the same time.
I love that idea. It's like turning listening practice into a cultural adventure. But accents aren't the only obstacle, right? What about when people talk really fast? I know I'm not the only one who struggles to keep up when native speakers start talking a mile a minute.
You're right. Fast speech can be really tough, even for people who've been learning English for a while. It's like trying to catch a runaway train. The words fly by before you can even process them.
It feels exactly like that. So what can we do to get better at keeping up with those speedy speakers?
One helpful thing is to concentrate on the most important words and phrases. Instead of trying to catch every single word, train your ear to pick out the info that really matters. It's like scanning a text for the key points. You don't have to read every single word to get the gist of what it's saying.
So it's about prioritizing the essential stuff and not getting hung up on every little detail. But how do you train your ear to do that? It's not like we can just flip a switch and suddenly become keyword detecting experts.
Practice is definitely key, but there are also some exercises you can do to improve your ability to pick out those keywords and phrases. One simple one is to listen to a short audio clip and try to write down as many keywords as you can from memory. Then listen again and see how many you missed. Do that regularly, and you'll start to see patterns and get a better feel for which words are the heavy hitters in a sentence or conversation.
That's a great tip. I'm totally going to try that. But what about when focusing on keywords just isn't enough? Are there any other strategies for dealing with fast talkers?
Absolutely. Remember those playback speed controls we were talking about earlier? They're not just for slowing things down, they can also speed things up. Once you feel okay listening at a regular pace, try bumping up the speed little by little. It's like giving your listening skills a speed workout. You're pushing yourself to process information faster and more efficiently.
I like the sound of that. It's like training for a listening marathon. You wouldn't start out running full speed, you'd build up your stamina over time. But what about those times when we hit a wall and just can't keep up no matter how hard we try?
Don't hesitate to use the pause and rewind buttons. It's perfectly fine to go back and listen to those tricky parts a few times until you're sure you've got them. Even native speakers do this sometimes, especially when they're listening to something complex or something they've never heard before.
That makes me feel so much better. Sometimes I feel like I'm failing if I have to keep rewinding, but you're right, it's just part of learning. It's better to take your time and understand than to rush through and miss important stuff. Speaking of real-world challenges, let's talk about background noise for a minute. I think we all know how annoying it is trying to listen to something when there are a ton of other sounds going on around you.
You're so right. Background noise can be a huge obstacle to listening effectively. It's like trying to have a conversation at a rock concert. The music and all the chatter make it almost impossible to focus on what the other person is saying.
Exactly. So how can we train our ears to block out those distractions and focus on what's being said, even when it's noisy?
One helpful thing is to practice listening in places with different levels of background noise. Instead of always looking for the quietest spot in the library, try listening to podcasts while you're walking down a busy street or chatting in a crowded cafe. Think of it like giving your ears a noise vaccine. The more you train your brain to filter out those distractions, the easier it'll be to focus on the spoken word, even in noisy situations.
That's a brilliant way to put it. It's like building up an immunity to noise pollution. But what about when we can't control the environment we're in? Are there other techniques for dealing with background noise?
Another helpful thing is to focus on the speaker's lips. When you're in a noisy place, visual cues can be really helpful in understanding what's being said. It's like having subtitles for real-life conversations. Your eyes can fill in the blanks when your ears are having trouble keeping up.
That's such a great tip. I never really thought about using visual cues like that, but it makes perfect sense. So it's all about using all of our senses to understand what we're hearing, not just relying on our ears.
Exactly. It's about being an active listener and really engaging with the material in different ways. But even with amazing listening skills, sometimes the audio quality itself can be a problem. It's like trying to understand a message on a walkie-talkie with bad reception. All the static and muffled sounds make it nearly impossible to figure out what's being said.
Ugh, I know exactly what you mean. It's incredibly frustrating, especially when you're trying your best to focus. So what can we do when the audio quality is bad? Is it a lost cause, or are there ways to salvage the listening experience?
Even though it can be tough, there are things you can do to make the most of those recordings. One thing is to play around with the audio settings on your player. Lots of audio players have built-in equalizers that let you tweak the sound and maybe reduce some of that background noise or make the audio clearer.
I've seen those equalizer settings, but they always kind of intimidated me. I'm not really sure how to use them the right way.
It's definitely worth giving them a try. They can seem a little complicated at first, but once you get used to them, you can really change the sound for the better. Try messing with the different frequencies to see if you can make the audio clearer. You might be surprised by how much you can improve the listening experience with just a few adjustments.
Okay, I'm going to give that a shot. I've got a few podcasts that could definitely use some audio help. But what about those times when even tweaking the settings doesn't really work? Are there any other strategies for understanding those mumbled messages?
Of course. One of your most powerful listening tools is context. If you're having a hard time understanding certain words or phrases because the audio's bad, try using the surrounding info to piece together the meaning. It's like being a detective. You're using clues from the context to solve the mystery of those missing words.
I love that. It's like we're listening Sherlock Holmeses, using our deduction skills to crack the code of the garbled audio. So it's not just about hearing the words, it's about using all our knowledge and thinking skills to make sense of what we're hearing, even when the audio isn't great.
Exactly. Being a good listener is about being an active participant, engaging with the material, and using every tool you have to understand what's being said, even when you're facing challenges like background noise or bad audio quality.
This has been an incredible journey into the world of listening skills. I feel so much more confident and prepared to handle those real-life listening situations.
That's awesome to hear. And remember, this journey doesn't end here. Getting better at listening is a continuous process, and there's always something new to learn and discover.
Well said. We'll be back with more insights and strategies in part 3, so stick with us. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into listening skills here on the English Prep Podcast. It feels like we've covered so much already, from different test formats to dealing with accents and fast talkers.
We have, and we even talked about handling background noise and bad audio quality. It's like we've put together a whole survival kit for listening.
I like that. It's like we've got all the tools we need to deal with any listening challenge that comes our way. But before we wrap up, I'm curious about something you mentioned earlier about active engagement. You said that getting better at listening isn't just about passively listening. It's about actively engaging with what you're hearing. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Sure. Think about it this way. When you're actively engaged in listening, you're not just letting the words go in one ear and out the other. You're actually processing them, thinking about them, and connecting them to what you already know. It's kind of like the difference between just reading a textbook without really thinking and actively highlighting key points, taking notes, and asking yourself questions as you go.
Oh, I see what you mean. It's about making our brains work while we listen, not just our ears. But how do we actually do that? How do we become more active listeners?
One technique I really suggest is called predictive listening. Before you even start listening to something, take a minute to think about the topic. What do you already know about it? What questions do you have? What are you hoping to learn from listening?
So it's like setting the scene in our minds before the play even starts. By using what we already know and thinking about what to expect, we're getting our brains ready to really pay attention to what we're about to hear.
Exactly. You're giving your brain a head start in the listening race. And once you start listening, don't be shy about asking yourself questions along the way. What's the speaker's main point? What are they using to back up what they're saying? What does it all mean? How does this fit in with what I already know?
It's like we're challenging ourselves to think critically about what we're hearing instead of just taking it all in without really thinking. It's like turning listening into a brain workout.
You got it. And just like any workout, the more you do it, the stronger those listening muscles get. Oh, and one last tip for being an active listener. Try to connect what you're hearing to your own life and experiences. Think about how the information relates to things you've read, seen, or done. It makes it more personal, relevant, and easier to remember.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive into listening skills. I feel like I've learned a whole new way to approach listening and really engage with what I'm hearing.
I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah.
And remember, these skills aren't just good for passing exams. They're super important for everything in life, from relationships to work.
Absolutely. By becoming more active and engaged listeners, we're opening ourselves up to a world of opportunities to learn, grow, and connect. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey into the amazing world of listening. We'll be back with more deep dives in future episodes, so make sure to tune in.